Okay, hello. Two Pinebooks walk into a bar. I'm Vagrant Cascadian, Debian user for 20-some years. The Pinebook has been around since 2017 with some small amount of RAM, a quad-core processor that's nice and slow and therefore immune to Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities. It's got eMMC, microSD, comes in two sizes, 11 and 14 inch, and it has a nice white plastic case. In around 2019, the Pinebook Pro started landing in people's hands. It has a significant amount of more RAM, though some people wouldn't think it was all that significant. 6 cores, 2 of which are actually kind of fast. Therefore, it's vulnerable to Spectre Meltdown and has some much nicer storage options, notably NVMe, and it has a black metal case, although parts of it are still plastic. On these boards, what works out of the box? We've got some of your basic laptop functionality, such as screen, keyboard, USB. You can even see the battery these days, and to a limited degree, you've got some hardware acceleration through the GPU, at least enough to run some basic Wayland applications, such as Sway. And on the Pinebook Pro, you've got working USB-C and NVMe. These things all basically work in Bullseye. The Pinebook actually had moderate support in Buster. Things that do not work include Wi-Fi. Maybe somebody else can get it to work. I've actually never really tried, and if you remember back at DebConf 19, I had a nice little USB dongle with a huge antenna, and people kept asking me, what the heck is that for? Well, that's what it's for. External displays don't really work, which makes it hard to present at conferences. Suspend I haven't seen it work. And occasionally the Pinebook Pro has issues on power down or reboot where it keeps running and drains your battery, which is not a great feature. Audio kind of sort of works on the Pinebook Pro and kind of sort of works on the Pinebook, but not very reliably. So one of the other awesome features that both of these boards have is they have an audio jack that you can switch to a serial console. And so the first time I ever realized I successfully booted the Pinebook Pro because there was nothing or the Pinebook, because there was nothing displayed on the screen, I plugged it into a speaker and heard the sounds of Linux booting, and that was pretty awesome. Recently, somebody dropped me a little note saying, hey, there are a few features, if we enabled in Debian, the Pinebook Pro would work. So we just recently, in April, added support for USB-C, battery gauge, and limited audio support. That was pretty awesome. I was not expecting to see that in Bullseye, so happy. And I included a patch in the Debian kernel, which is maybe not in the best form, but we basically disabled the Type-C DisplayPort in the Pinebook Pro because it didn't work, and it actually broke displaying on the LCD or EDP panel, depending on how particular you are about acronyms. So Linul Foro pointed me out to that patch. Zhen Hongpan actually submitted upstream. I don't know if it ever landed upstream yet, but we should be looking at that for Bookworm. But this actually enabled output on the screen. Also, we had to add these same modules again to the debian-installer kernel packages, which is always an adventure, as I've talked about in some previous talks. And with that, very late in the release cycle, I managed to actually install using debian-installer with a few manual tweaks on the Pinebook Pro. That was pretty exciting. But So we've actually got Debian installer images. I believe they basically work for both the Pinebook Pro and the Pinebook, though honestly, I haven't tested them since around April. So maybe something's broken since then. This happens from time to time. But one of the things that got me really excited was seeing a talk at FOSDEM in 2019, one image to rule them all. This may not seem like an amazing thing, but in the ARM world, the idea that you could have one image and just boot arbitrary platforms is pretty hard to come by. So this talk kind of described what would we have to do to actually get U-boot loading on a number of different platforms from a single image. And one thing I noticed in that talk were there are a bunch of offsets used. And I thought, what if I could at least get two platforms to work all off the same image? And so I experimented looking at the offsets presented in that presentation. I noticed, okay, sector 16 on the Pinebook, sector 64 on the Pinebook Pro. Okay, we dumped some images on there. And it seemed to work because I tested it in the order that it would work. So it worked on the Pinebook, but not on the Pinebook Pro, because that sector 80 for the second part of the bootloader is awfully close to sector 64 on the Pinebook. So it clobbered the Pinebook latter part of the bootloader, clobbered the early stage bootloader on the Pinebook Pro. So thanks to that awesome talk at FOSDEM, I decided to try alternate rockship locations, and sector 2112 was a success. So I was in a position where I had a single image that successfully loaded U-boot from both the Pinebook and the Pinebook Pro. So one image, two laptops, not exactly one image to rule them all, but one image to rule, well, two platforms, which was pretty exciting, and that kind of made sense. You've got a Pinebook Pro. It'd be ideal if people didn't have to figure out exactly which one to load. So I then, one of my other fantasies for a long time was to make live images for ARM platforms. So I whipped up a little debstrap recipe. It's kind of like debootstrap, but way more cool, and it basically relies on apt functioning. So this I used to generate a squashfs image, partition a device, leaving 16 megabytes free space because the Pinebook images install much later on the device. The Pinebook Pro has to, it installs pretty far into the boot partition. Normally there's only 1 megabyte free space on your partition. All right, you mount the partition, you make some directories, and you copy some files out of the squashfs image into the right places, and create an ext Linux conf, and this configuration was sufficient to boot both platforms. Then I installed the U-boot rockchip from Experimental, which has support for actually interacting with U-boot, like using the keyboard and LCD, another amazing feature on these ARM platforms. Many boards, you just had to use a serial console, but this image will actually work without a serial console. You install the U-boot rockchip, install U-boot Sunshi, and then reinstall the part of Pinebook Pro that U-boot Sunshi install overwrote in the right place. Ta-da! I have an image that successfully boots both platforms. I would love, I think it's very feasible to also add support for UEFI here, although it's been tricky to generate a valid grub config and mark the partitions appropriately. But in theory, this would actually allow us to boot on numerous other platforms. So that's pretty much it for my very speedy talk. We hurry up and wait, right? So anyway, any questions? Have people racked up questions? I see a few questions. No sample audio. Yeah, well, so the audio on the Pinebook, I had it working at one point during the Bullseye cycle, and then it stopped working, and it just makes nice squealy sounds. So I don't know. There's more work to do with that. Question 2, is the built-in Wi-Fi connected over SDIO or PCIe or USB? Off the top of my head, I'm not quite sure. I once knew this stuff. But yeah, I know, and it's of course a different Wi-Fi for both the Pinebook Pro and the Pinebook itself. I think the Pinebook Pro stuff might actually be in mainline Linux, or at least part of it, but it may require non-free firmware. And the Pinebook One is some variant that I don't think is supported in mainline Linux. Question 3, easier to adapt programs especially to run on Pinebook Arch than other PC architectures. It's just an ARM64 platform. It's not any more difficult than any other architecture. Yeah, Debian has pretty broad support for the ARM64 platform, so I don't think that's terribly... yeah, I'm not sure exactly how hard it is relative to any other architecture that Debian supports. Am I becoming less enthusiastic about ARM now that RISC-64 hardware is becoming more available? Yes and no. While ARM platforms are not nearly as awesome as RISC-64 platforms, they have a much longer history of actually being supportive, so they're better supported now than RISC-V 64. What a mouthful. So they're better supported now, but I would love to see someday RISC-V 64 be more broadly supported, and pretty soon the Mount Reform platform is coming out, and somebody's working on an actual upgrade card for it that would actually allow you to run a RISC-V platform on it. Okay, yeah, so another question pops in. What about Nvidia acquisition? Yeah, in general, Nvidia has not had the best history with free software. They've had a mixed history with free software. So they bought ARM. I know some key people in the Debian community moved away from ARM. I don't know if that's related to the Nvidia acquisition, but ARM has had a long and shaky road even before Nvidia came along. We'll see how it goes. I don't have strong opinions on that. I'm not in any way affiliated with ARM or Nvidia or any of these platforms. I just like to tinker with what comes my way. So, anything else? All right. So I'm pretty excited to have just kind of put together some live images that boot on more than one platform for ARM. So here we are. All right. Well, I think we'll probably wrap this up then, unless there's any last minute comments.